This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana. Carvana. Pickup fees may apply.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to Episode 8 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Today, we'll converse with Gregory O'Malley, Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and author of the new book, Final Passages, The Intercolonial Slave Trade of British America, 1619 to 1807. During our conversation, Greg will reveal the difference between the transatlantic and intercolonial slave trades, how the intercolonial slave trade spread slavery throughout North and South America, and why we need to view the slave trade not just as a forced migration of millions of African people, but as a trade. But first, I am pleased to announce that we are now on iTunes. This means you can subscribe to Ben Franklin's World using the largest podcast directory. To find us, either search for Ben Franklin's World in iTunes or visit benfranklinsworld.com/iTunes. That link will take you directly to our iTunes listing. Okay, enough for our exciting announcements. Let's get to our conversation with Greg O'Malley.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us today is Gregory E. O'Malley, an Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research interests include colonial British America, the Atlantic world, and the slave trade. Greg is the author of the prize-winning article, Beyond the Middle Passage, Slave Migration from the Caribbean to North America, 1619 to 1807, which was published by the William & Mary Quarterly in 2009, and the new book, Final Passages, The Intercolonial Slave Trade of British America, 1619 to 1807. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So today we are going to talk about the intercolonial slave trade and your new book. But before we get to business, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Like, how did you become interested in early American history and the history of the slave trade in particular?
Like a lot of people, I think my interest in history was sparked by some great teachers that I had along the way, especially a couple in high school, Mr. Perini and Mr. Lockerbie, who really sort of switched me on to history. And then I think my interest in early American history in some ways was just an accident of going to college in Boston. And I knew I wanted to study history, but didn't have a strong interest in any particular period. But arriving there, that just seemed like the field of history to go into was early American. And Jill Lepore was still at Boston University at that time, and the opportunity to work with her was a big part of it as well. diversity and the ways in which Americans have struggled with being a diverse society has always been a theme that has really interested me. So I think that was part of what drew me to slavery. If I was doing early American history, those struggles in America of how to deal with slavery and its legacy has always been just something I found very compelling.
And I can certainly relate to the effect Boston has on one's desire to, study early American history. My parents used to march my brother and I along the Freedom Trail every year as kids. So that's what I blame for my interest in early American history.
Yeah, I grew up on the West Coast, so for me it was really an eye-opening thing to move to the Northeast and be living in a place with a different kind of where, history just felt alive all around you. That was something that really got me excited.
And you have some really great history on the West Coast, because I did my grad work at UC Davis, and I was shocked when they did not begin the traditional narrative of early American history with Jamestown. They went all the way back to Spanish America.
That's great.
So.
That's a great way to organize it and challenge the common narrative.
So Greg's new book, Final Passages, investigates the intercolonial slave trade, or the trade in slaves that occurred after the famed or infamous Middle Passage. Before we discuss the intercolonial trade, I wonder if Greg would provide us with an overview of how the transatlantic slave trade worked. How did slaves become slaves? What was the Middle Passage like? And how did slaves experience it?
Well, it's a big question. There's a lot of ways to look at that issue, but one of the key things I think to understanding how the transatlantic slave trade worked is to keep in mind that while we tend to think about the slave trade as a forced migration, and so in some ways we want to study it as parallel to other kinds of migrations. One of the keys for understanding how it actually worked is reckoning with the ugly fact that it was operated as a trade, that people were being bought and sold, and the people making the decisions about the itineraries of the travelers were merchants, and they were making their decisions based on what would be most profitable for their trade. So you had European traders venturing to the African coast, and where they were buying slaves from African traders who were selling other Africans, and then shipping them to the New World, where they would sell those slaves, and they would choose their destinations based on what seemed most profitable, rather than necessarily where the labor needs of individual colonies were greatest or things like that. They had their own bottom line in mind. So the Middle Passage is that phase of the slave trade that carried people across the Atlantic Ocean. And the name for Middle Passage comes from the fact that for these traders, they were engaging in what was usually a three-part journey. They would sail from Europe to Africa, or sometimes from North America to Africa, with various trade goods that they would sell in Africa in exchange for enslaved people. Then in a second passage, or a middle passage, they would carry people across the Atlantic, and then they would sell enslaved people and take on colonial crops and produce of various kinds and ship that in a third passage back to Europe, or back to whatever their port of origin was. So they referred to the passage as the Middle Passage because for them it was the second part of a three-part journey. Now, ironically, we've used that name Middle Passage to talk about slaves' experiences, but it's actually a Eurocentric term. It's how Europeans understood the journey. And one of the things that I'm arguing, and what I'm trying to evoke with the title Final Passages, is that idea of a middle passage actually fits enslaved people's experiences pretty well, despite the fact that the term was originally a Eurocentric one. And I say that because most slaves fell into slavery in Africa through wars, through raids for kidnapping by other African traders, and they often experienced pretty extensive journeys within Africa just to get to the Atlantic coast, where they were purchased by European slave traders. Then they faced that middle passage across the Atlantic, And what I'm arguing in the book is that actually for a lot of them, the journey didn't end when they arrived in an American port and were purchased by a plantation owner. A lot of the people at those sales were other merchants. They were merchants trading from one colony to another, and so they were buying enslaved people only to put them on yet another ship for another passage that extended people's journeys to American slavery. So that's the how I understand the slave trade working in a nutshell, and I'm happy to clarify any of that if there's more I need to explain.
So that last part of their journey, once they'd arrived in the Caribbean, was the intercolonial slave trade, or is that something different?
Yeah, that's the intercolonial slave trade. That last passage. So the way I define it is any subsequent journey after the Atlantic crossing from Africa to anywhere in the Americas. If they embarked on yet another journey from one American location to another, I consider that the intercolonial slave trade, or the final passage, as I phrase it in the book's title.
And how far did that intercolonial slave trade extend? Is it just going to British North America? Or is it going elsewhere?
It's going in all different directions, and sometimes it could be over fairly short distances, but other times the voyages could be surprisingly long. So in the book, I'm focusing on enslaved people who arrived in British American ports, but trying to follow them wherever they went after that. And some of them, that's voyages within the British Empire. So it might be from a British Caribbean colony to the British North American mainland, or it might even be from a North American port on an extended journey into the continental interior as settlements started pushing into the backcountry. But actually, a larger number of people caught up in this intercolonial slave trade were leaving the British Empire. They were arriving in a British American colony, typically in the Caribbean, and they were being transported from there, often illegally, sometimes legally, into either French colonies or Spanish colonies. And some of those journeys could be remarkably extensive. There were a lot of people who would arrive in some place like Jamaica, board another ship that would take them to a port in Spanish America, maybe in Panama, maybe in what's now Colombia, at Cartagena. And from there, they would face an extensive journey within Spanish America, sometimes to places as far away as like Peru. So it could be thousands of miles. It could be a longer journey than the journey across the Atlantic was.
And this was one of the intriguing things I found about your book, one of the many intriguing things. But one of the arguments that Greg makes in Final's passages is that the intercolonial slave trade opened a freer trade between the British, Spanish, and French colonies in North and South America. Greg, can you tell us about the 17th and 18th century Atlantic world and economy, and what about it prevented the different colonies from freely trading with each other?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things to understand is that these empires in the Atlantic world tended to think about trade policy based on different philosophies than the reigning economic theories of today, one of the important ones being mercantilism. And under that theory of governing an empire or managing trade policy, the way they thought of colonies was that they should be exclusive trading partners of the mother country. So they wanted these colonies to supply raw materials, bring certain kinds of natural resources into the economy of the mother country, and to serve as markets for any kinds of manufactured or finished goods produced in the mother country. So they were these sort of captive markets and exclusive sites for acquiring resources. So what that meant was that most of these empires adopted trade policies that were designed to severely limit the amount of trade that their colonies had with foreign powers. Now, one of the interesting things about the slave trade is that the different empires had very different amounts of access to sources of enslaved people within Africa. So what you got were certain colonies in certain empires were much better supplied with enslaved people. They had much easier access to this coerced labor force than other colonies did. And as a result, prices for slaves would be dramatically different across these imperial borders. So despite the policies of the empires wanting to restrict that kind of trade across imperial borders, there was a strong incentive for individual colonists, individual slaveholders or aspiring slaveholders, individual merchants to circumnavigate those trade policies and conduct trade with each other.
So in some ways, the intercolonial slave trade could be an illicit trade, the smuggling of slaves. We know that smuggling happened all over colonial America, not just in British North America, but French and Spanish and even Dutch North America as well. So obviously, if they're trading slaves from one British island to the other British island, that might be a legal trade. But if you're a British trader, like in your book, and you're going to a French colony or a Spanish colony, that would be illegal. What were the consequences for that if they got caught?
It depends on who catches them. The most common penalty for illegal trade of various kinds in this era was simply the confiscation of the cargo. And so that's one of the big reasons why these trades usually, I argue, why most of the illegal trade across these imperial boundaries was conducted as an intercolonial trade rather than, say, British merchants going directly from Africa to a French colony in the Caribbean, for example. Because from a British colony in the Caribbean, right next door to that French colony, it would be much easier for a smuggler to maybe develop, some personal connections, someone on the other side of this border to help them smuggle people in. They'd have much better access to the latest news about, whether there's a new governor in the colony who might be more or less tolerant of this kind of smuggling, things like that. It's much easier over these shorter distances to arrange this kind of smuggling operation. They could also do it on smaller ships, alleviating the risk a little bit. If you're only trying to smuggle in 20 slaves, you're taking a much smaller risk from the perspective of the trader than you are if you're coming across the Atlantic Ocean with old news, maybe news that's a year old about conditions in the colonies, and you've got a ship full of 350 enslaved people. That's worth an enormous amount of money in the, crude monetary calculus of the slave trade. So those traders viewed that as an enormous risk. They would rather make the safe move and go directly to a British colony where they had legal access, protection of the law.
Were there any points that this transatlantic trade between the different imperial colonies was legal, or was it always illegal?
There were points that it was legal, and that's part of where my argument is that the slave trade could push empires towards adopting freer trade policies. Because many of them, though in general they frowned on this kind of trade across imperial borders, they sometimes recognize benefits to allowing this kind of slave trading. And so sometimes that would push these empires towards loosening their trade policies a little bit. And this happened kind of in a piecemeal way. For the British, they, from a much earlier date, tended to be supportive of it because they felt like what they received in exchange for enslaved people were the kinds of raw materials that made colonies valuable in the first place. So if they could sell enslaved people in Spanish America in exchange for the silver that the Spanish are mining in their colonies, they considered that a win, even though it might violate the strictest interpretations of a mercantilist, notions about having closed colonies to foreign trade. So they tended to make exceptions to their series of laws called the Navigation Acts that governed, that were the laws that said no Spanish, no French traders in our colonies. They would make exceptions to those acts. They would write letters to governors saying, don't enforce this on the slave trade to Spanish America. We kind of like that trade. So it was this way of loosening up those restrictions. And as the 18th century wore on, more and more of the empires started seeing some benefits to this. So for a lot of the colonial period, the British were tolerating this trade, but on the French and Spanish end of things, they had severe restrictions on it. But the Spanish negotiated a common exception to their trade restrictions against foreign trade with their colonies to get in slaves. They had strong needs for a labor force. So they would often negotiate a contract known as the Asiento de Negros with various traders from foreign countries or empires or kingdoms to bring slaves in. And it would be limited. They could only engage in the slave trade or sometimes a few other related trades. But it was a way to get a labor force in. So in various ways, all of these empires were sometimes finding themselves saying these restrictive trade policies are keeping us from getting where we want to go in relation to either labor or profitable trade, getting access to certain kinds of resources. And gradually these policies sort of eroded over time. And freer trade policies took their place. And I see the slave trade as sort of central in some of those decisions.
Now, one of the other aspects that I found very interesting about your book was that the transatlantic slave trade, or not the transatlantic trade, but the intercolonial trade, more so than the transatlantic trade, expanded slavery into mainland British North America, which were the 13 colonies that became the 13 states. Mm-hmm. And I was curious, why didn't transatlantic captains or merchants in the slave trade directly with North American ports? Why was it important for the intercolonial trade to bring slaves into mainland North America?
Sure, it's a great question. One of the key things to understanding the dynamics of the transatlantic slave trade within the British Empire is that the real driver of this system were the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, not what was going on in British North America. The vast majority of the enslaved people who toiled in the British Empire in the Americas did so in the Caribbean on these sugar plantations. That was the big sort of the core of the system. And so for the traders coming from Africa to the Americas, one of their biggest concerns in making the slave trade profitable was selling slaves quickly and selling them at high prices. And so they like to go to these big markets where there were large plantation owners who, might buy enslaved people 10, 20 at a time, where they could arrive with a cargo of 350 people and sell them quickly. And not have prices collapse where they wouldn't glut the market. Whereas a lot of the colonies in North America had smaller demands, especially in their early years of developing the slave system. They didn't have a lot of wealthy plantation owners who could buy large numbers of slaves. And so these traders worried that they would sort of glut the market, that the prices would drop quickly if they arrived with large numbers of slaves, or that it would just take them too long, which carried other risks. They viewed mortality as a risk in this trade, not for humanitarian reasons, but because it affected their bottom line. So they gravitated towards the biggest markets. That being said, there was demand for enslaved labor in lots of North American colonies. And so intercolonial traders who were trading between the Caribbean and North America, they could often engage in that trade, mixing a few enslaved people with a cargo of various kinds of goods that they were acquiring in the Caribbean, sugar, rum, tropical fruits, things like that, and then carry maybe 10 slaves and sell them at quite high prices. So that was the dynamic that was driving this. And of course there were exceptions to that. Once, South Carolina becomes a booming plantation colony, or Virginia makes its transition to growing tobacco with enslaved labor, those largest colonies in terms of slavery attracted direct traders coming from Africa. But lots of the smaller colonies, in terms of their commitment to slavery, and even South Carolina and Virginia in their early years of getting established with the institution, they tended to look more to this indirect trade from the Caribbean that brought smaller numbers of people at a time.
Interesting. Another wonderful thing that you do in your book is you really try to humanize the slave's experience, which is difficult because they didn't leave a lot of records behind. Many of them couldn't write or, speak English. Could you tell us about the slave's experience in the intercolonial slave trade? How were they treated? Did they face any dangers that they wouldn't have faced on the Middle Passage in this intercolonial trade? And how long did it take them to get to their final destinations?
Sure. I think the key thing to remember for understanding the experiences of captives in this intercolonial trade is that for most of them, the interval was quite short between their transatlantic journey and their intercolonial journey. And we know from lots of wonderful research that's been done on the transatlantic portion of the slave trade that this was a debilitating experience. Mortality was frightening on these journeys, but even those who didn't succumb to diseases, didn't die from them, often suffered them and recovered, or were still in the process of recovering from them when they boarded an intercolonial slave trading vessel. So one of the things that means is that this voyage was dangerous and deadly for many. You've got people often carrying communicable diseases, still suffering from effects of diseases, or just from effects of things like dehydration and malnutrition. They're already suffering these things at the start of this journey. So one of the scary things about this intercolonial trade is that if you look at mortality rates, people actually died at even higher rates or faster rates than they did on the transatlantic voyage. So that's one thing that they were in danger of. Another thing is that in the way that the slave trade delivered people to the Atlantic coast within Africa, because people were often taken captive in things like wars or raids on a village, you often got people coming to the coast from the same region. Several members of the same community might be enslaved at the same point and be carried by traders, African traders, to the coast as a group. So they might then be purchased by the same European trader, put aboard the same transatlantic vessel, and arrive together in the Americas. One of the things about the final passage, or this intercolonial trade, is that it tended to disperse people. The intercolonial traders didn't tend to buy all 300 people disembarking from a voyage that had crossed the Atlantic. They might only buy 10 of those people, which might mean that brothers and sisters who had survived the transatlantic slave trade together were bought by different people in the Americas and put on different vessels for the final passage. People who, shared language or kinship were often separated. So that was another real danger that this dispersal trade, this intercolonial trade, confronted people with.
It's hard not to feel sympathy for these people. I know we're not supposed to cast judgments about history and events of the past as historians, but it's pretty difficult not to get, emotional about it. Were there certain types of slaves that were more likely to participate in the intercolonial slave trade? Were these intercolonial traders looking for particular kinds of slaves, women, children, men, young slaves, old slaves?
They were, and for different merchants, depending on their needs, who they were looking for was different. There were sort of different strategies in this trade depending on where they were going. So, just to give two examples to show the contrast, a intercolonial trader who was buying enslaved people in, say, the Barbados, and planning to send those people to South Carolina in the 18th century, that trader knew that they would be competing in South Carolina with vessels arriving directly from Africa. And so their strategy would be to sort of be selective, pick and choose maybe what from their perspective were the best slaves out of this vessel that had arrived from Africa. So they tended to skew more towards healthy young adults. Typically, they prioritized men over women, but the main factors were that these people seemed, healthy, hardy, and strong. And then they could compete effectively, and they would advertise the enslaved people that they delivered to South Carolina as, they would use phrases like the choice of 2 cargoes in Barbados or something like that, to indicate that they had been very selective. They're bringing the best of the best. Whereas another trader, also buying enslaved people in Barbados, but heading to someplace like North Carolina, where vessels very rarely arrive directly from Africa, they might be approaching the whole transaction in a very different way. They're thinking, in North Carolina, there are people who are desperate for slaves because vessels don't arrive from Africa. There are enslaved people who don't sell well here in the heart of the system, because the plantation owners have lots of options. And so the strongest men and women would get picked quickly, purchased quickly, and there might be children. There might be slightly older slaves. There might be slaves that didn't look quite as strong or well suited to plantation toil, who prices would drop and drop and drop as these people didn't sell. And this trader headed to North Carolina might specialize in buying people like that, with the idea that in North Carolina, buyers had fewer options, couldn't afford to be as selective, and they might pay better prices for these people who were overlooked in another market. So depending on the route of trade that you're talking about at any given time, the patterns of who would be chosen for that route of trade could be completely different. And I think this is also part of the reason why you get this challenge for the enslaved people of separations, that the decisions of the traders were based on these kind of calculations that had nothing to do with which enslaved person feels a bond with which other enslaved person. It's just these market forces that are sending people in different directions, this sort of cold calculus.
And it's a cold calculus because they view slaves as commodities.
They really do. They really do. One of the things that was most striking and troubling to me in this research was the way in which, in a lot of the sources that I use are merchants, are letters of various merchants who are organizing these kinds of ventures. And the way they will talk or write about enslaved people interchangeably with barrels of sugar is just, it's shocking and incredibly troubling to see these letters where, a merchant will just say, if the price is low enough when you're in Barbados, they're writing to a ship captain, say, purchase X number of barrels. But if the price for sugar is too high, it won't sell well when you get here, so buy 100 slaves. There's no differentiation in the way they talk about it between one commodity and another, even though one of these so-called commodities is human beings.
So what is the end of the story? When and how did the intercolonial slave trade come to an end? And did its end also mean the end of the Atlantic slave trade?
The answer to that differs a little bit depending on both how you want to think about it, how you want to define the intercolonial slave trade, and also which route of the trade that you're talking about. One of the things that brought some of the routes to an end was the American Revolution and the changes that were happening in some of the colonies in their attitudes towards engaging in this trade. So most of the North American colonies at the time of independence closed the slave trade as part of their strategic embargoes of British goods during the Revolution and during the protests leading up to the American Revolution. And most of the states didn't reopen the slave trade thereafter, after securing their independence. So that ended a lot of these routes of the trade. Another thing that brought it to a close was the move in the early 19th century in the British sphere to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. And what's often forgotten in histories of that movement was that slightly before the 1807 total abolition of the British transatlantic slave trade, one of the steps they took along the way to that was passing a partial abolition that just barred British slave traders from selling enslaved people in foreign colonies. It was a way to get around the arguments that defenders of the slave trade within the British Empire were making, that the colonies depended on this labor supply. Well, that was a much harder argument to use to support a slave trade to the colonies of rival empires. The British Empire had little interest in supporting a labor supply for French America or Spanish America. So that was passed in 1805, effective 1806, cut off the biggest branch of the slave trade, and then the total British abolition, effective 1808, really ended it, at least insofar as we think of the intercolonial slave trade as an ongoing voyage for people who had just survived the transatlantic journey. And the reason I say that is because even after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, there was a booming domestic slave trade, especially within the United States, that wasn't survivors of the Middle Passage moving on, but it was mostly American-born slaves being moved from one region within the United States to another, especially as cotton expanded and brought slavery further west. There was a booming domestic slave trade. That's not what I study, and other scholars have done really wonderful research on that topic. But I see that as a slightly different phenomenon, simply because it wasn't a Atlantic trade. But in that sense, it didn't end until the end of slavery in a certain way.
This has been a really interesting conversation, and I certainly learned a lot about the intercolonial and the transatlantic slave trade from you. We just have a few minutes left, which means it is time for the time warp.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Are you ready for the time warp, Greg?
I'm ready for the time warp.
So our question is, in your opinion, what might have happened if Great Britain, Spain, and France had stuck to their mercantilist policies and not allowed their colonists to trade slaves with each other? Would there have been an intercolonial slave trade? Would the institution of slavery have spread as far and as wide as it did?
That's an interesting question. I think I get to cheat a little bit on the time warp because to a certain degree, we know what would have happened, I think. And that's because for most of the 18th century, France really did cling, even more so than Spain did and than Britain did, to these policies. France tried very hard to block this intercolonial slave trade. And what that meant was that since Britain had a more established trading presence in Africa and supplied more enslaved people to the Americas, is that prices were substantially lower for enslaved people in the British colonies of the Caribbean than they were in the French colonies in the Caribbean. So there was a powerful incentive for both French plantation owners who wanted to buy slaves and British traders who had slaves that they wanted to sell to get around these trade restrictions. And they found all kinds of inventive ways to do that. French traders would go into British colonies and buy enslaved people and then come back and pretend that these were slaves they had already owned who were just out doing some kind of maritime work. They would meet at neutral colonies at some of the islands, in the Caribbean that were not firmly controlled by any of the colonial powers yet. And individual traders and plantation owners who were interested in circumventing the law would meet up at those neutral islands and make their exchanges, and then one way or another, the French colonists would smuggle enslaved people back in. So, in effect, they tried to enforce their mercantilist policies and failed. And that's what ultimately led them to relax some of those policies, was sort of it was a fait accompli. These policies weren't working, and so they tried lowering the barriers and then managing the trade and taxing the trade and things like that instead. So I get to cheat on the time warp. We have real evidence.
Well, that's all right. It was a really good answer, so I guess we'll allow you to cheat there. So before we conclude, can you tell us about what aspect of early American history you're researching now?
Sure. There's a few different things that I'm interested in. I'll just tell you about one, but it's a project that builds off of this one, or maybe off a question that's been troubling me that the research for Final Passages couldn't answer. Because one of the things that I've always been interested in the history of slavery in the Americas is that we know that the fairly small number of enslaved people who were delivered to North America, that population grows dramatically over the centuries and decades of slavery until we have this huge number of enslaved people in the United States by the eve of the Civil War. Whereas in the Caribbean, there's a very different experience, which is that the population of enslaved people needs to be continually replenished by the slave trade because there's not enough just demographic growth, reproduction, and healthy child rearing. So this has always been seen as a stark contrast between historians, and I had originally hoped that my research on the intercolonial slave trade might go some way to explaining that difference, that actually the demographic performance of these two populations wasn't that different. We had just underestimated how many people physically moved from the Caribbean to North America, changing the numbers of people in both places. And I have, through this research, shown that a lot of people made that kind of move, but it's actually not enough to explain the demographic phenomenon that I was talking about. So I'm continuing to look into that and look at it from a few different angles, including I want to do more work now on gendered patterns in the intercolonial slave trade, because if women were overrepresented, which I have some reasons to suspect, in the slave trade to North America vis-a-vis the Caribbean, it could go a long way to explaining why that population grows so much more. But I also think there are other factors we need to consider that have a lot to do with how we talk about race and how we read race in historical records. I think a lot of colonial records talk about quote-unquote Negroes as the term that they use, and we tend to read that through our modern race binary lens as just meaning person from Africa or person of African descent. Whereas I think a lot of these colonial figures use the term Negro to mean enslaved person. And sometimes that can mask more complicated genealogies for some of these people. I think there may have been far more Native Americans being labeled as Negroes in colonial records. And I think that could have had profound implications for what we perceive as a dramatic growth of an enslaved population composed entirely of Africans and people of African descent, when actually there were other kinds of people subsumed under that label of Negro in various censuses and plantation records and things like that. So that's a project that I really want to explore now that this book is finally out.
Well, good luck. Those sound like fascinating issues and questions, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with. When we do want to find more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you, where's the best place to look for that information?
Probably on the History Department website at California Santa Cruz, which is history.ucsc.edu. I'm also on academia.edu, so you can search for me there. And then, of course, the book is available on I think on your website and also on, various booksellers online and things like that. So you can search for me on Amazon if you're interested in the book.
And you tweet too, right?
I do tweet. Yes, I'm at go Mally is my Twitter handle. So you can look for me on Twitter.
And I'll include links to all of that on the show notes page of this episode. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Greg.
Thanks so much for having me.
The slave trade forced millions of African people to migrate to North and South America. But Greg makes a compelling case for why we should also view the slave trade as a trade. Viewing the slave trade as a trade helps us understand the motives of slave traders, how African cultures spread throughout the Atlantic world, and how viewing slaves as commodities helped slave traders ignore the slaves' inherent humanity. Understanding the intercolonial slave trade also adds depth to our knowledge about slavery in North and South America. The journey into slavery for most African captives did not end when they arrived at a Caribbean entrepôt like Kingston, Jamaica. Most captives had to embark on a second journey that caused death for some and led all to experience additional separations and emotional anguish. You can find information about Greg, his new book, Final Passages, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/008. I would be really grateful if you would rate and review this podcast, because your rating will help us keep Ben Franklin's World visible and findable for new people. If you give Ben Franklin's World a 5-star rating and review, I'll be sure to mention your name in an upcoming episode as a small way to say thank you. To rate and review Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history, just visit benfranklinsworld.com/iTunes or benfranklinsworld.com/Stitcher.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.